company this Ramadan.
Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidir. The time is 9:46 Central African Time. And we're going to be switching gears now to, I think, my favorite part of the show, where we get to sit down with various guests who come from all walks of life, who've done incredible things and have very, very interesting stories to tell. And today we have a really interesting guest who's joining us in studio. He's young, he's very, very outspoken, he's unapologetic and provocative in South Africa's political discourse. It's just 22 years of age, if I'm not mistaken. He has positioned himself as a political and human rights activist, engaging some of the country's most uncomfortable conversations, from race, from identity, geopolitics, genocide, not genocide, and you getting to decide what it is. He's always at the center, and he's joining us in our studios, Pieter Adrian Kriel. No, the pleasure is all ours. And I'm looking forward to a very, very interesting conversation, especially looking at the state of the world and how things are at this moment. But I want to start with Pieter as human being, 22 years of age. You almost represent what we thought South Africa would become after 1994, but unfortunately things didn't go that route. As a born free, as a 22-year-old, what was a moment of reckoning for you when how you see things, how you view South Africa, almost changed from what I assume you would have traditionally been taught to understand and to know about who you are in the country that you live in?
So I'd say a defining moment for my outspokenness, my activism, was in high school. We were at break, and there were a few students that were called into the principal's office because they were defying orders that they had to cut their hair in a certain way and express themselves in a certain manner. And these were people of African descent. And I felt attacked by that because myself, I always wanted to have longer hair, and school was always like, you know what, that's not according to our tradition in this school. And I felt as a government institution that was totally stepping over the rights of people. So I joined a protest in school, and we actually got called into the principal's office for that. And I think that was a defining moment for me, because ever since then, I started social media, posting things, speaking my mind, without fear of backlash.
But backlash did come.
Backlash did come.
Backlash is still coming. And, I know, for one, when you almost have a different opinion, how you think, how you view the world, your circle, your immediate people, his families, friends, acquaintances, when you veer off from what is supposedly the norm of how you people as a group view the world, there's almost a shunning, that comes. You are othered. How did you deal with that, being othered, being an outcast of some sort within your community?
Well, I think I'm very eager to accept the title. I'd be willing to say that I am an outcast in the sense that I do feel that the Afrikaner community is outdated. We still live in the past. We still hold on to imperialist and apartheid ideologies and notions and ideals. And as a whole, I have called for the redefinition of the entire Afrikaner community. Because let's be honest, I've never said not to be proud of being an Afrikaner, of being a person of European heritage. But what I'm saying is, take a look at all of the bad things that have happened in the name of whiteness, of Afrikanerdom. And I say, well, let's take a step forward. Let's build something new. Let's show the world that, well, we are the products of democracy. We will not follow in the footsteps of our parents. And I think that's why I'm okay being called an outcast. I'm ready to redefine what the Afrikaner community is.
What would you say the average male Afrikaner, similar to you in age, probably hasn't had the moment of reckoning that you had, view South Africa today? What is their immediate thought of this country, its people, or majority of its people, which happen to be Black South African, when you interact with them and how they view the world?
Well, I think most people, and I'm speaking from within my own community, white men my age, they take the world through the lens their parents present them. So whatever culture or tradition or ideology their parents gave them from the day they were born, that is probably what they ended up believing. Because most of our young men are either in clubs, or they're playing sport, or they're having fun out in the outside world, where in fact they should be educating themselves on the atrocities that is happening not just in this country, with the total lack of human rights, upholding human rights, and basically across the world. So I think young people from my community should be particularly invested in education, specifically history, politics, economics, and being able to think critically. And that comes through debating and having discussions about these things, not agreeing with it on everything with each other, but debating nonetheless. And that doesn't happen too much in the Afrikaner community, because like you said, if you even think about questioning a norm, you are already labeled an outsider.
Is there an understanding that South Africa is of all of us? South Africa is supposed to be built by young people of all races, coming from all different backgrounds. It doesn't help being in a corner complaining, finger pointing. Is there a sense of responsibility? I think that's where I want to land, from Afrikaner people of South Africa.
Yes, there's a huge responsibility, specifically looking at the younger community. I made a video a while back stating that I do feel like all older generations of Afrikaners born during apartheid should apologize for apartheid. Even if you did not install the laws, even if you did not form part of the government, you were still complicit in a system that put millions of people under oppression. So and you benefited from that economic model. So therefore, I do think they should apologize. But the younger generation, they have kind of a shift in mentality and responsibility. They don't need to apologize because they were not complicit, but they do have a huge responsibility in acknowledging the crimes of the past and trying to build a more equal and equitable South Africa.
Even amongst, Black South Africans, right? I follow you on social media, and whenever there's questions and conversations that you probably sparked or have to do with you, there's a section of Black South Africans who feel you probably have a white savior mentality. There've been lots of quotes that talk about white liberals. I'm not sure if I can call you a white liberal. Would you consider yourself a white liberal?
I'm not a white liberal because I don't believe in free market economies. So I'm not a capitalist. So I do think a lot of people mislabel me a liberal because I believe in progressive policies, which liberals tend to. But liberals still believe in capitalism. I don't believe in capitalism. I believe it should be abolished. Yeah.
How do you respond to that criticism of because being a young Black South African myself, I know there's still a certain kind of misconceptions about white Afrikaner male, whether your intentions are good or bad. We don't know the conversations, that we don't know each other. I can put it that way. How do you respond to that? The fact that you have a quote unquote white savior mentality. I mean, there've been open letters directed to you criticizing some of the way that you think, the views that you have. How do you respond to that?
Well, firstly, I would like to this is very important. I would like to acknowledge the immense privilege that I was able to be brought up into. I was brought up in an Afrikaner white middle class household. I was able to travel to different parts of South Africa during Decembers for holidays, stayed in hotels and things. So I was very privileged. I went to a good school, even though it was a public school. I had access to a lot of things a lot of people don't or didn't have. But I decided to take a step back a few years ago, and I decided to speak out about things that are damaging not just to our nation but to the continent as a whole, because I do believe, like I've said previously, as a young Afrikaner who has been, or whose generations who have been on this continent for so long, I feel like I have a responsibility to take grip of the problems in this continent and take hand with fellow Black and brown brothers and sisters and say, you know what, let's fix this. We don't have to live like this. We can work together and all of that. But where I do think the problem comes in with white saviorness, I do think we all have an ego. And I would agree that as all people, I have an ego, but I don't I'm not in it for power. I'm not a politician. I don't believe in using power to get what you want. I believe in saying what I feel needs to be said. I'm a political commentator. I'm an activist. I'm not trying to gain anything through this. I don't get paid through my social medias. But I would like to respond to Gillian Skitter and
Yes.
her message to me.
The open letter.
The open letter.
Yeah.
See, Gillian has been in this line of work for such a long time, and I have respect for that. But I do feel like her calling me out for speaking on issues I, as a South African, find relevant, calling me privileged and disenfranchised or disillusioned. That is the epitome of white privilege, coming from a white person, saying that, Pieter Kriel can't speak on this. Myself, as Gillian Skitter, I should be the only white person to speak on this. That is the epitome of white privilege. I have never said I'm the only white person able to speak on this. I don't even look at race. I'm a humanist. I believe all humans are equal, and I believe in a just future for all humans, regardless of ideologies.
And I think that's very, very important to note. There's a few topics, just looking at time, that I want us to touch on. They range quite vastly, and I want to get your opinion in them. Obviously, the first one would be the white genocide conversation, the United States of America, Trump, and how we've almost seen a re-emergence of white racists, a re-emergence of white supremacists who they were in the shadows. There'll be little sects of them, whether it's social media or just out and about in real life. But it looks like with the Trump administration, it feels fashionable in the white supremacist, racist kind of circles to come out. People are not ashamed and embarrassed of being, fitting that mold. Where we find ourselves today, white Afrikaners, the genocide, and just this re-emergence of white supremacy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's very important to make the correlation between the Trump administration being so close with Afrikaner nationalism today, and previous US administrations being so close to Pretoria during apartheid, because during apartheid the US saw South Africa as a very anti-reliable communist ally. So they could use South Africa to try and stop the spreading of communism throughout Africa. So that is why the US used South Africa back then, solely for strategic reasons. And today I do think the right, the populist nationalist movements in the US see a similar trend in South Africa today. They see that they can have economic benefit, they can have investment benefit, or mineral contracts by trying to influence South African politics. And to a large extent, they have been able to do that through groups like AfriForum and Solidariteit, who have been spreading misinformation and propaganda to other countries. Because let's be honest, if there's a white genocide in South Africa, let's grant that. If that is true, why does Trump not grant people from actual war-torn countries and refugee countries in Africa? Why doesn't he grant them refugee status? It's because they're not white. That's why.
In the spirit of, I don't know if I can still say nation building, how does the average South African now interact with this topic? The topic of white genocide, the topic of, white people feeling like they've been oppressed. I don't know, 57, 58 race-based laws that we don't seem to know about. How do you interact with it in a spirit of nation building, if you can? Because you can only do it if it's a give or take. It is accepted on the other side, and you can, deal with the issue in a way that fosters dialogue. But if it doesn't, then it doesn't. Is there a way to do that?
Yes, I always say, you can only grow as a human being if you're outside of your comfort zone. And that is what I'm trying to do with my platform and with my views and so forth. I'm trying to put people and take them and have them stop in their tracks and go, what he just said, it's provocative. Maybe I should think about it.
Yeah.
But 2 points on what you said about genocide and Afrikaners' view on that. Let's be honest, most Afrikaners I have spoken to do not believe there's a genocide in South Africa. They do believe that there's a huge crime problem, which probably affects all, and most certainly affects all South Africans, but they don't think it's a genocide, even though some of them might think it's targeted on farms, which we can dispute if we want to. But the second point I want to bring is that all Afrikaners I've spoken to, or most of them, agree that they are being targeted economically in some way or some sense. And I take that to a quote that I heard a while back: to the privileged, equality feels like oppression. And that is very true, because for the last 30 years, whites, South Africans specifically, have started to integrate more with black and brown communities on an economic level. We've seen the dispersion of wealth.
Yeah.
We've seen the black middle class emerging, but we've also seen a bit of a reduction in white wealth, though the majority of white people, white men specifically, still make up 70% of boardrooms. To me, I think it's arrogant to say that, or to acknowledge that, well, there's not a genocide, but we still feel targeted. How can you feel targeted in a country that still economically prefers your skin color?
Very, very important point. I want to move on now. I think in the last, three years now, the biggest conversation has been about an actual genocide that's currently happening in Gaza. You had the privilege to be in close proximity. You're in Jerusalem, correct? Just give us a reassessment of that, and what did you learn from that journey, and how it impacted how you saw the world, how you saw South Africa, and the reality of how we can be a voice for the people of Palestine that are going through a very, very atrocious period right now.
Yeah, so we actually tried to do a documentary on the Palestinian genocide. I don't call it a conflict, because I do believe that Palestinians fighting with sticks and stones, you can't justify that as being a conflict. So genocide, we went to the occupied West Bank. We went to places like Nablus and Hebron and Jerusalem in that part. But we learned so much, in the sense that I saw firsthand what apartheid looks like. I was born after the dispensation, so I never saw what spatial apartheid in that sense.
There's the remnants of it.
Yeah, the remnants in Cape Town, but I mean physically walking through apartheid, the spatial planning, the seeing wealthy Israelis live on the one side and seeing very disenfranchised, very poor Palestinians living on the one side, having to go through a lot of checkpoints on a daily basis. That gave me an insight into what apartheid in South Africa could have looked like in its flesh. And it changed my life completely. My girlfriend accompanied me to Palestine, and we both came back with a very angry and changed heart, because I do think when we compare what is happening in other parts of the world and what is happening in Palestine, you have internal conflicts, let's say, for example, in other parts of Africa, where different proxies or groups are fighting against each other. But that is not the case in Palestine. You have an army with nuclear weapons, or the capacity of nuclear weapon launching, fighting people that live in absolute horrendous conditions that was created by the Israeli regime. So I don't think there's any comparison of what is happening in Palestine in any part of the world, because Palestine is still being excluded from all economic models, and it's still being swept under the rug by Israel.
Well, why do you think it's so difficult for other people to understand that when it is so clear? Is it deliberately trying to not understand, to try and not acknowledge that there is an actual genocide, or it's something else? Is maybe accepting it mean I'm complicit in a way, thus I have to hold myself accountable? From your perspective, there's still people to this day who say, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, quote unquote, Hamas are terrorist, and October the 7th is the reason why we find ourselves. But you're like, it didn't start on October the 7th. Everyone knows that. Yeah,
I would say that, and people might disagree with me, I do think one of the main reasons is political and economic, but I do also think religion ties a role here, because you have a few million people in Israel literally believing that that land was given to them by the Hebrew God, the God of the Bible. So you have to acknowledge that part. There's some kind of religious hold to that place, whether that is historically true or not. And then you have politics and economics. And that is the big part in swaying public opinion, because geopolitics, specifically from the United States, their propaganda, their news, their movies, and Israel have been pushing this narrative around the world that Palestine is the aggressor, that the Palestinians are aggressors when they attack guards, or when they stand up for their rights, or when they refuse to be spit on or slapped in the face. That to me shows that the West has infiltrated public opinion on social media. I mean, there's evidence of social media campaigns being funded by Israel to sway public opinion, and I don't doubt for a second that the United States does that too, probably to a bigger scale than Israel. So if you have a capitalist society like the US pumping millions of dollars into Israel and social media propaganda, it's very hard to sway public opinion on social media.
And do you think from a South African point of view, it is a similar kind of way of interacting with it, especially from those that still deny, even considering the history that South Africa has, with an actual apartheid? Is it also similar? I don't want to say for white South Africans, because there are some white South Africans who understand, who interact quite boldly with the genocide in Gaza, and they're unequivocal. They tell you that it is a genocide, it is an apartheid.
Very few of them.
Very few. But I think it wouldn't be fair to not acknowledge that fact, right?
Yeah.
For the other South Africans who still refuse, do you think it would bring into perspective what happened here in South Africa? Because there's still people who believe apartheid was just. There was nothing wrong with it.
It was God's will.
It was God's will. Yeah. So seeing what's happening in Gaza would force you to acknowledge the atrocities of South Africa, which to this day you still refuse to acknowledge.
Well, you would think so. You would think the majority of white South Africans, specifically young white South Africans who were born after the dispensation, would recognize their parents' mistakes through what has happened in our country and the 30 years that we have had democracy, and we've seen the effects of colonialism and apartheid play through. I would think that white South Africans would acknowledge, well, look, we know what apartheid looks like. It's happening in Palestine. But like I said earlier, equality to the privileged feels like oppression. So to me, it would be, it's kind of convenient for white South Africans not to call it a genocide. So that I would be so bold as to say I can understand it, because they are oppressors. They don't care about history. They just complicit in everything. But people of color, specifically Black South Africans, who were supported by the Palestinian Authority during apartheid, I would say that's a big level of complicity. And I worked with a man named Nkosi Zulu. He's a journalist, teacher from KZN, and he told me that a lot of people in the Black community still believe Israel has a hold over Palestine because it's written like that in the Bible.
That's I wanted to mention that point, that I still have myself, people in my circle who believe this is the Israel of the Bible, and to speak out against it would be essentially speaking out against the Bible, be speaking up against the word of God. So that's a really good point.
To me, it's very strange, because you can acknowledge the Jewish people within the Bible and still say that the state of Israel is a Zionist entity and not the one that was found in the Bible. But that's a very specific point. People of color in South Africa were supported by the Palestinian Authority. They were supported by countries like Iran and Russia and China. And for them to support an apartheid state like Israel, to me, is astonishing.
It's crazy. I want to move on. Orania. I think it has been thrust into the headlines sometime last year. It's a difficult one to grapple with, because to be honest, from a Black South African perspective, I'm against it wholeheartedly. I think it's creating something that's very, very dangerous. It could be a precedence for Israel, a version of Israel.
It's what it is.
An enclave, being built in South Africa. The people talking about Cape Town, being an independent state, absolutely nonsense. I don't think that should ever happen. But I also accept that from the government's point of view, you almost make it easy for this narrative to be built. The fact that, there could be, whether true or not, a little town somewhere with a few white Afrikaner supremacists who are making it happen. They're building roads, they're building, we don't know if it's true, it all can be propaganda. But I feel to a large part, because of the failures of the government, they almost had a role to play. We can't deny the fact that 30 years on, so much more could have been done by post-apartheid ANC. From your point of view, Orania, what do you make of it? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think two thoughts on that. Urania does not have the right to exist, in my opinion, whether the ANC has done a good job or a bad job. And I say that because setting up an Afrikaner nationalist, racist enclave is not a justification for the failure of the ANC, because it still excludes the majority of people who live in this country who are African of descent. So I think that is a very important point. But I do think racist enclaves like Kleinfontein and Urania, they open up a door to a future where we have a very much more divided South Africa. Because let's be honest, you'll always have people joining these groups who want to be part of this nationalist Afrikaner haven. But if the government allows it, that would mean that they are complicit in allowing the establishment of these kinds of racist groups. Because whether they call it Urania themselves, whether they call it racist or not, the principles which they base their acceptance on is Afrikaner, Christian, blah, 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 blah. So clearly to me, that is like AfriForum and the Democratic Alliance. It's clearly hiding their true racist nature and displaying it as a preservation of culture tactic, which to me is nonsense. Because if you want to preserve your culture, you'll learn how to evolve your culture and adapt to the continent that your forefathers invaded. So I'd say you'd have to adapt to Africa, otherwise you'd risk extinction.
Just two last points before we wrap it up. Your assessment of South Africa in 2026. This is a democracy that's 31, 32 years old now. There are conversations that are bubbling up saying, it should be a mature democracy right now. It should be a country where there's little conversations around race and around what apartheid was and what whiteness and blackness still represent in the country. We should almost start getting over them, in a sense of not forgetting our history, but in a sense of we're reaching an equilibrium. There's an understanding from both sides of what the country needs to be and the direction it needs to take. From your side, looking at South Africa 31 years on, how would you make of the country? And secondly, any parting shot, anything that you have on your chest, whether it's on current affairs, what's happening in the world right now that you want to rant on, you can go ahead.
A 2026 goal I would implore all South Africans to take to heart is to forget about this notion of it happened 30 years ago. We should forget about it. Because let's be honest, the people in the Congo whose hands were cut off by King Leopold during colonialism, whose hands were cut off because they didn't meet daily quotas, I promise you, their children, their generations that live today, they've not forgotten about their parents and their grandparents' hands being cut off because
that's
they did.
Only two generations.
That's only two generations because their parents' hands were cut off because of capitalist quotas not made. So I'd say to all South Africans, remember apartheid, remember your history. It's not a calling to go back to history or to live in the history. It should be a reminder as to what the future foundations of a country should look like and should not look like. So the past is very much necessary to building an equal and equitable future.
They have it. Pieter Kriel.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Hope we chat again soon. The world is crazy. I think it's voices like yours, voices of young people who are utilizing, I think, a gift that maybe previous generations didn't have, the gift of social media, being able to in real time talk and influence so many other people, using it wisely. And I applaud you for that. And I hope we chat again soon when we have enough time. It was an interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. If you have Gillian Skitter anytime, make sure to invite me.
I'll try.
Thank you.
And with that, we've come to the end of today's edition of News and Views. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. Bye for now.